Hey folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast. It's a really sunny day outside. My name is Mark Fraser. I'm joined by the Guardian of the Galaxy, Chris Cusack.
Chris the Pratt Cusack.
You said it, not me.
Am I more or less cancelled than Chris Pratt?
Oh, way less cancelled.
Thanks. It's getting pretty toasty in here, but we need to keep the windows shut because of all the boy racers.
So many boy racers.
If you can hear the sweat squeaking out our pores as this goes on, apologies. I'll try and EQ it out.
What's the EQ setting for sweat, Chris?
We'll find out. It's not a problem you have very often in Scotland, so I don't want to be seen to be complaining.
Unfortunately, I've been unable to take full advantage of the weather because I've been packing.
Yeah.
So I've spent all my time indoors.
I love
boxes.
moving house. Is there anything better than moving house?
Everything's better than moving house.
It's great, man. It's great. Great workout. You get to find all your old stuff.
You get to bin so much shit, which is quite cathartic.
I think it gets a bad rap.
I'm wanting to say right now, I used to run a record label called Cold War Legacy Records.
That's Cold War Legacy.
Cold War Legacy Records. And I have loads of CDs under my bed that I'm about to chuck in the dump. so that brings us on to our next subject, because Unsung Record Club subscribers, you may find that next month you get a bumper parcel in the post. Full of like 4 copies of the same CD.
On that subject though, the Unsung Record Club, I personally shipped out the latest batch. Apologies if they're a couple of days late, but the fucking Queen just won't die.
She won't fucking die, man.
She's sticking around, and for 2 days our post office is closed, presumably
to think about the Queen.
Yeah. So Record Club, subscribe to that please. So basically what's happening is we're sending out really, really good music, either in digital or digital and analog form, shipping sometimes quite rare limited edition vinyls to people, stuff that you probably won't find or encounter, but since you're listening to this show, you obviously trust us enough to at least sacrifice your time. Why not just give us money as well? So we curate stuff based on your tastes. You give us an idea of what you want, and we send you out records that we've sourced. All the money that we spend goes to the artists and or their labels, and so far I believe we've managed to get one thing reissued, one thing pressed to vinyl, and a band that is now going through its archives thanks to the renewed interest and looking at releasing a bunch of recordings that they hadn't previously released. That's Gas Giant. For those of you lucky enough to get the Gas Giant album, yeah, it's a really good initiative. I mean, you can fund the podcast in the normal way, £4 a month, less than £1 an episode, and you get all the bonus stuff that we're doing, which is pretty regular these days and of a pretty high standard. A little bit more NSFW sometimes than the normal podcast, but
that's what you pay for.
But yeah, please go and subscribe. You can dip in and out as much as you want. So if you fancy subscribing for 1 month to try it out, do that, and then just go back down to 0 if you want, if you hate us, if you resent us. But we really appreciate it, because the bands are benefiting, the labels are benefiting, and you're benefiting, and we're benefiting. It's helping to make this sort of sustainable.
We should probably say as well that if you do like trust us so much that you just want to give us a big wad of cash, we have now enabled annual subscriptions as well. We've had a couple of people that have been, more than a couple of people, quite a few people who have turned on annual subscriptions. So you get I believe it's a 16% discount, which is technically 2 months free.
Oh yeah.
Which is pretty cool. So you can also do that on our Patreon as well.
I know that we're giving you a pretty hard sell here, but I should add, we do throw in complimentary things just because we're nice like that. And when Christmas comes around, we're obviously going to do something nice for you then as well. So yeah, get on board. Just imagine that feeling when the door goes and you get handed an LP mailer and you're like, yes.
Yeah, more fucking vinyl.
Yeah. So get in about it.
Get in about it.
This week, my choice.
Your choice.
It doesn't really match the weather.
Nah, it doesn't.
It should be drizzling.
Yeah.
Well, should it?
I mean,
let's discover that.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a reputation, shall we say.
This is a band I've been wanting to do for a while. Part of the reason that it's taken so long is because I couldn't quite figure out which record to do. And as soon as I say the name of the act, I think a lot of people will nod and be like, oh yeah, that's tricky. So we're going to cover Sparklehorse. Sparklehorse.
Yeah. There's a pub named after them in Glasgow.
There is. Thanks. I've got an Nexus at the end of this, you know.
Have you?
Yeah. Sparklehorse is also somewhat interchangeable with a musician, producer called Mark Linkous, who's no longer with us. Now, Sparklehorse have in total 5 albums to their name, I believe, and the first 3 albums, Viva Dixie Submarine Transmission Plot from 95, Good Morning Spider from 98, and It's a Wonderful Life from 2001 are all really good albums. Let's just get that out of the way. And it was difficult to try and pick which one, because this is an interesting band, but you need an angle. I am going to be leaning heavily on the subjectivity of this. Sparklehorse, for anybody that's ever shopped in a cool record store, probably isn't that unsung. And if you're into Sparklehorse, then the album I've chosen isn't unsung within their canon. However, the case I'm going to make, and I think it's a pretty solid case, is that Sparklehorse in general are fairly unsung. So I have chosen the third record, It's a Wonderful Life, after much deliberation.
It's a It's a wonderful life.
Now, Mark, I think you sort of bolster my case here a bit by acknowledging that this is a band that the name is out there. You're familiar with it, but you hadn't heard it.
Yeah, I'd only heard of the name because of, you know, when Mark passed away, which is now 12 years ago, which still kind of feels like yesterday.
Yeah.
And obviously the name of the pub as well. But I think, for me, I think I have a reasonably wide knowledge of music, and I'd only just heard of this band that one time, and maybe a few other friends had maybe brought it up, but I never listened to them, and I'm kind of a bit surprised by that, because this is kind of the shit that I like, you know.
That's interesting. I wasn't sure if this would be just a little bit too much to the indie twee side of it.
Elliott Smith could be more twee sometimes than this.
That's true. And
I really like Elliott Smith.
There's definitely a through line. So I think it's, as I've said, Mark Linkous is no longer with us by his own hand, and thus, for people that know what happened, the title "It's a Wonderful Life" probably seems ironic straight away. But we'll get into that. So, as I said, Sparklehorse is kind of effectively interchangeable with Mark Linkous. A really interesting guy. Multi-layered, interesting background. Steve Albini, not known to be the most forthcoming with compliments, called him one of the most genuine and unaffected people he'd ever met in music. Since Linkous' death, there have been attempts to sort of encourage his estate to allow the release of more material. Al Shipley wrote in Spin in 2020, in the 10 years since Linkous died, his estate has reportedly blocked several tribute projects, including a covers album and a documentary. The unfinished tracks recorded for Sparklehorse's 5th album will likely never be released, but slowly some other unreleased songs have surfaced. That article actually by Al Shipley makes a good point and really underlines that Linkous is kind of commonly seen as being a bit of a musician's musician, you know, more well known within musical circles than he is within the general public. That's kind of safe to say. As I said, for the purposes of the show, my argument is that he was part of a sound and a movement, an indie movement, intentionally or not, that included bands like Flaming Lips. Grandaddy, Mercury Rev, and more.
The day we met, the way I lit your cigarette, the way it changed into a strange cold.
All of those acts had breakthrough albums in some way or another, and Sparklehorse never quite managed that, and thus those bands sort of still feature in the general musical ether, you know, cafes, bars, TV shows, to an extent that Sparklehorse increasingly don't. You know, not that they ever really did, but they increasingly don't. You don't just walk into a coffee shop and hear them very often, but I mean, I hear Hewlett's Daughter by Grandaddy all the fucking time. So
Sir, I'm the only one to get back your stolen guns. I should have been your son.
So I'm making my case on that basis, really.
Do you think that if he'd lived, that they would have continued to slowly gain?
I do
actually. Not the word, but you know what I mean.
I think he was making the kind of music that wasn't particularly age dependent. It wasn't like he was going to get too old to be sad or too old to be indie. I mean, as so many other artists have proven. I suspect he would have gone on and made, I'm not saying it would have been better, I'm not saying it would have been worse, but he would have gone on and made music of real worth. Yeah, I think so.
Because the last couple of albums were on, apart from the Dark Night of the Soul, and I guess the Fish Tank record, the others were on Capitol, right? They were on a major label, so he clearly had the platform there to push. And on the first record, he toured with Radiohead, didn't he? So there was obviously a knowledge there of him and his talent, I suppose. That was. Yeah,
but these things come and go, you know. And I also think it's interesting if you look at somebody like Wayne Coyne, who ended up producing pop singles with, was it Lady Gaga or something. Mark Linkous had a lot of respect within the industry. If you look at that Dark Night of the Soul, you know, David Lynch, Suzanne Vega, all the people from many of the bands that we've mentioned and more, he had a lot of fans within the industry, and I think those kind of contacts and that kind of credibility gets you pretty far. It's maybe not an immediate payoff, but I think that would have borne fruits in the long term. To give it a bit of background to the guy himself, born in 1962 in Richmond, Virginia, he described himself as being a bit of a problem child in his teens. He had 3 brothers, but he seemed to be a wee bit of a tearaway, which included joining a motorcycle gang at some point.
Wow.
He started playing music to avoid following many members of his family into a career in the coal mines. A lot of his family were miners. He at one point had moved out to LA and ended up playing in a band called the Dancing Hoods, who had sort of modest college radio success in the late 1980s. That, bear in mind, was happening at the height of glam rock and metal, which was something he didn't have time for, really didn't have time for. He moved back to Richmond, Virginia, I think it was the very late 80s, right at the end of the 1980s. I believe that was an attempt to sort of escape a cycle of drink and drug abuse. This is something that sort of recurs, and it's clearly a vulnerability within his personality. One of his brothers was living in Richmond as well, and he was musical, so they hooked up to start playing music. He was quite disillusioned, as I said. He really detested the hair metal movement, but he described how Tom Waits, specifically the albums Swordfish Trombones, Rain Dogs and Bone Machine, which we've discussed on the show, on the Tom Waits album, in his words, were the roadmap for Viva Dixie Submarine Transmission Plot for that album. In a 2006 interview, actually, he even singled out Waits' recording of the song Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet as, quote, the one song that sort of saved me when I had given up making music.
Never failed me yet. Jesus' blood never failed me yet. There's one thing I know.
So yeah, he was struggling for a bit of identity, and he found his niche. And then you had the kind of alternative music explosion of the early 90s. Around that time, in Summon, Virginia, he fronted bands Johnson Family and Salt Chunk Mary, who I think did okay on a kind of local level. Only one of their tunes really survived after the demise of the bands. The song Someday I Will Treat You Good, that was eventually recorded by Sparklehorse for the debut album.
She just couldn't see things my way.
As regards the name Sparklehorse, Linkous stated that he chose it because, first and foremost, the two words sounded good together, and it could also loosely be used as a metaphor for a motorcycle. And as I say, from some point in his teens, he had a bit of an affinity for that. At its inception, the members of Sparklehorse included Paul Watson. I think he was doing everything from banjo, cornet, lap steel to electric guitar. Scott Minor, drums, organ, banjo as well. Johnny Hott, Hott, quite a name there, Wurlitzer percussion, backing vocals, and Scott Fitzsimmons on stand-up bass, vertical bass. Some of those guys contributed on into Sparklehorse, right up in fact to the posthumous last album, which has a lot of collaborators on it, including the original members. So yeah, the 5 albums: Viva Dixie, which we're going to refer to it as that to save a bit of time, because god damn it, Good Morning Spider, It's a Wonderful Life, and then Dreamt for Light Years in the Belly of a Mountain in 2006, and then posthumously Dark Night of the Soul, actually made in conjunction with Danger Mouse, which came out in 2010, just shortly after. I think it was only about 4 months after he'd passed away. Any initial thoughts, Matt?
Because of the reputation that I thought that this guy was kind of attained, I thought it was going to be mostly quite miserable music, but it's mostly not, which was nice. It was really nice, because when I was reading about It's a Wonderful Life, he talks about how people would always say that his music was miserable, and that was like the why that song was ironic.
It's interesting you mention that, because the quote is, I got fed up with people in America thinking that my music is morose and depressing and all that. That song and album title is like a fuck you to journalists or people who are not smart enough to see what it is. But in the end, it was more about how every day you should pick up something, no matter how minuscule or microscopic it is, and when you go to bed you can say, I was glad that I was alive to see that. That's what it's all about. And yeah, I agree. Like the point I made at the start about the title seeming ironic, I actually think it's not nearly as morose as as it's construed as. It is very melancholy at times, but he throws in, he's got a self-awareness, and he throws in these little light moments, whether it's a chord change or a lyric. He knows when he's being a bit depressing, frankly, and he sort of does things to work against it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go through the albums in a wee second, I guess, but I was pleasantly surprised by what I heard. Well,
we're going to do something that I don't think we've done before, and it's kind of in response to a bit of feedback that we've had in the past, a bit of a trigger warning. So Mark Linkous passed away as a result of suicide. So we are going to discuss suicide here, be warned. As I say, we've had light criticism, constructive criticism in the past for mentioning the manner of death. I think we got some of that after Elliott Smith. Whilst we took it on board, I don't buy into that entirely, I'm afraid. I personally have lost multiple friends to suicide. In some cases in particular, I think it behooves us to acknowledge the methods, because some of these are preventable acts of desperation and fleeting moments of despair, and knowing the signs and even restricting access to certain means can help avoid what are irreversible consequences of momentary actions, This man died by his own hand in a way that is especially all too typical in the United States, and so I think pretending that didn't happen or avoiding that subject isn't doing anyone any favours. We're talking about a self-inflicted gunshot wound here. Ultimately his death became part of his legacy, just as it did with Elliott Smith. You can't really skirt round it. It's it's the elephant in the room. If you have lost someone to suicide, or if you feel particularly vulnerable around these conversations, you have our utmost sympathy. I would encourage you to probably skip forward a few minutes, but let's unpack some of the mystique around that as well. Firstly, some people report that Mark Linkous has had a prior suicide attempt in 1996. That doesn't actually seem to be the case, and so I think we should elaborate. In 96, he was touring Europe with Radiohead. This was shortly after Viva Dixie Submarine Transmission Plot was released. He had consumed a combination of antidepressants, Valium, alcohol and heroin in a London hotel room. Now, he spoke after this and said that he didn't recall the overdose and didn't think it was intentional, just stupidity and abusive behaviour. Family members have noticed that his recurring bouts with depression became deeper and more prolonged following that overdose, however. That overdose took quite a physical toll, and I think that amplified issues he'd had with mood and mental health. When he'd collapsed during that cocktail of drugs and drink, he was left kind of crumpled on the ground unconscious, with his legs trapped under him in a really awkward position for about 14 hours. That did damage to his legs, but also supposedly the build-up of potassium in his system when he was moved caused his heart to stop for I think it stopped for about 3 minutes. He also nearly lost his legs. He had a lot of surgery and required a wheelchair for 6 months, as well as he required dialysis because of the damage that was done to his body. Actually, in 1997, he performed some shows in a wheelchair and was then fitted with leg braces to try and recover some of his strength. Although his legs did recover somewhat, they never fully recovered. And he had also become slightly paranoid that he had developed brain damage from it, from the overdose, from the temporary death, from like that potassium release into his system that caused his heart to stop. And he was concerned for a long time that it had affected permanently his ability to write music. It didn't, it seems, but that was an anxiety that he carried with him. So a man that was already dealing with an addictive personality, substance abuse issues and depression had this very real set of exacerbating circumstances arrive on top of that. He did ultimately take his own life in 2010, as we say. I think it's worth mentioning that, especially in the context of the appalling state of gun legislation and gun related fatalities in the USA. That's extremely topical right now, although to be honest, when can we last remember a time that it wasn't topical, because it's become so normalised. I think it was only today actually I was watching a report when the journalist was like, you do realise that when Columbine happened, that wasn't a typical thing. It was still shocking and an anomaly.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how in the years since then it's become almost routine.
It literally happens every day in America.
Incredible. So the problem with guns, we can't solve this here, but the problem with guns is a lot more than just people going into schools and workplaces and supermarkets and shooting. It's the ready availability of guns for people who are experiencing very dark thoughts, and also the huge number of domestic accidents that occur,
and also the lack of mental health availability, of mental health assistance that they can get, because it's just not available to them. I mean, there's no question that kind of familiar NRA line about, it's a mental health crisis. There's an element of truth to that, but there's a mental health crisis in a number of places, and nowhere can even fucking get close to the numbers in America. Absolutely, and that's the ubiquity of firearms. That, as I said, in Linkous's case, for example, he was supposedly hanging out with a bandmate and a friend when he received some text messages that had caused him to exclaim, "It's not good," something to that effect. That's quite an unusual thing. I mean, I was saying to you before this, I think if Mark Linkous was a bit more famous, there would be a kind of conspiracy vibe around that. Even Elliott Smith had a bit of that with his girlfriend, and the Elvis movies coming out. So I mean, how big do you have to be to have conspiracy theories spring up? That is strange. I wasn't able to find out what that was about, but he was quite perturbed by these messages, discreetly excused himself, went upstairs and recovered a weapon that he owned. I think this house was a house that he was going to be staying at, and so he had this weapon with him. I mean, it's a fucking... as far as I can tell, it was I think it's called an ITM, and basically modelled on an AK-47. 47. I might be wrong there, but it's a fucking ridiculous piece of equipment for any household to have in it, frankly. Anyway, he went and got his gun, left the house, walked down the street, sat on a curb, and, as was witnessed, shot himself in the chest. Again, apologies for going into details of that, but would Mark Linkous have died that night if he didn't have access to an assault rifle, basically? Maybe, but it would have been a lot harder to act in that moment, so maybe and maybe not. And access, no matter what your stance in it, access to that weapon made it easier. It did. That's not for a minute to suggest the guy would be alive now, but having access to a weapon that can do that much damage that quickly, you've had a drink, you hit a sudden low. Anybody that struggled with mental health will remember severe moments of despair, and he just had the tool right at his disposal, one press and it's done. So that's why I feel it's relevant to mention it, especially right now with what's going on in the States and this topic coming to the fore again, just as it will again. We shouldn't get numb to it, I agree. And the thing that always strikes me about that, and also with Elliott Smith, is the amount of sheer willpower it takes to do it in that particular manner.
It's true. It's dark stuff, but I just wish the means to do it was not so fucking easy to get hold of.
Yeah, man. Totally.
Anyway, let's bring it back.
Back to something a little bit more.
Hopefully you skillfully skipped through that if it wasn't to your tastes, but I'm sorry, I think it's appropriate. This is an adult show, and
we are grown-ass people.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the albums. As I said, in terms of the first 3 records, fans and critics alike can't quite agree on which was best, and there certainly isn't much in it, hence why it took me so long to make a decision and do this episode. I think it is worth digging through the 2 albums I didn't choose in a little more detail than normal, since I would suspect there are listeners that probably either already disagree with my choice, or indeed some that will probably go on to disagree. And I want to be clear, this guy has a limited but generally very strong catalogue left in his wake, so we can explore it and not be wasting anybody's time. So Viva Dixie, as we're now calling it, 1995, recorded and played by himself, auteured. I think it's important to say that when I came to Sparklehorse, I never really bought them as a rock band. Maybe across the first 2 albums, that's due to the way he recorded, you know, the drum machines, the lack of a live feel. There's something a little bit clinical about it, you know, you don't get the groove, there's a subtle something in between the spaces there that you just can't find. I think it's harder to convey a kind of energy in that format, unless you go to the extremes and get much more industrial. The track Someday I Will Treat You Good, as I said, was a minor US college radio hit. It also featured in a compilation called Alternator, which was actually where I first encountered them. It sold pretty well in the UK, I think. I mean, for a long time you saw it in charity shops as well, that it helped people like Everclear, Flaming Lips, PJ Harvey get a lot more recognition. They all had the tracks, and I think PJ Harvey was Sheila McGee, maybe. But the unusual title of Viva Dixie came from a dream Mark Linkous had. He described it as being about General Lee having a crude submarine back during the Civil War, and in the dream, quote, I could hear an old time band playing inside the submarine, all distorted by the water. So there you go. It features a mix of songs that he'd written years before, including Someday I Will Treat You Good, and others that were written supposedly just hours before they were actually tracked, including Cow and Weird Sisters. On it, a drum machine was used on many songs instead of a live drummer. So as a joke, you'll see in the credits that he's listed Al Isis as the drummer, brackets but better. Alesis is the name of a drum machine manufacturer, for anyone that doesn't know. The tunes themselves, Mark, I'm guessing you had a wee listen through this.
I did, yeah.
I think the first track, Homecoming Queen, is what he excels at.
Yeah,
it's an
good song.
It's an interesting first choice because it's so subdued.
Teeth, what was sharp is ground down and dumb. My crooked spine becoming more brittle.
The fragility and the intimacy, that is where he is at his best, I think.
I totally agree. I like that he does that in pretty much most of the albums as well, right? He comes in with something and ends usually with something which is quite fragile, and I don't know, I think that the lo-fi nature of it really helps, you know, playing about with the Optigan? It's like a synth you put optical discs in, and that's where you get the sample sounds from, and he uses that a lot to get like the stringy sounds and all that. It sounds great, but also very lo-fi, and it works, you know. And that's one of the part of the charm for me is hearing that lo-fi-ness, but it not sounding like it was recorded using a shoe, you know.
Yeah, he's actually spoken about that in a couple of interviews. Because the album after that also has that distinct sort of lo-fi sound. He said, I have a lot of cheap little keyboards and this Octagon, I think it's as you say, it's an Optigan thing, and this synth module that has a zillion different sounds in it. A lot of the keyboards I got at thrift stores. I have a little Casio SK1 as a built-in sampler. My favourite microphone I found at a landfill. It was on a CB base station. I've got these wireless intercoms from the 50s from an auction at a dentist office. So yeah, I mean, these are not plugins, these are actual bits of kit, and you can hear that in the music. The fourth track in it, Rainmaker, I think is interesting because it's peak mid-90s college radio fodder, and kind of reminiscent for me of bands like Marcy's Playground and Grandaddy, maybe even actually early Fountains of Wayne. I know they were more of a conventional band structure, but the way it's written, the melodies, even with just where it's pitched at audience-wise. it's not a song style for me that really works for them. It doesn't really get to me. That is a song though that has the lyric Spirit Ditch in it, and then the following song, track 5, is the song Spirit Ditch, which also has the lyric Spirit Ditch in it.
Woke up in a burned out basement, sleeping with.
For a lot of people, I think this is archetypal Sparklehorse. He's brilliant at this. It's achingly tender and vulnerable. It also has a really lovely use of double tracking in the vocal in it.
He does that quite a lot throughout his entire career. One of my favourite things about It's a Wonderful Life is when he does that with a female harmony, and it's just it really comes to life.
That is great. Yeah, I like the hard panning of it as well. The 2 tracks, one left, one right. Track 7 on this, Saturday. I think I got this off LimeWire or equivalent, maybe Epitonic that I've mentioned before. Probably took me about 10 hours to download it overnight. And I think it was because I'd heard somewhere I will treat you good on the alternator thing. So this was a surprise stylistically, but one of the first Sparklehorse songs to really just win me over. I love it. It reminds me a little bit of the output by a singer called Cass McCombs, and it has almost a sort of synthier John Lennon quality to the writing and the melodies in it. Just a great little bit of music. I
think generally there's a lot more Britishness in his music than there is Americanness. It's particularly on the second album, Good Morning Spider.
Yeah. Track 12, Heart of Darkness, is one that I immediately thought, I think Mark will dig this one. I think this will get you. It's that indie meets alt country.
Oh yeah, I got a heart of darkness. Oh yeah,
I think it's really effective. It's maybe not long term. It's not got the stickability of some other tunes, but in and of itself, it's a beautifully executed little song.
I fucking love a bit of Lap Steel, man.
I know you do. Yeah. Track 14, we mentioned it, Someday I Will Treat You Good. The only remnant of his previous projects that, like I said, was grouped in along stuff like Everclear and Flaming Lips. And I don't know, like, considering this was the one that was on that compilation, whilst I understand the choice for accessibility and sort of radio-friendly play potential, it's maybe a bit misleading in terms of Sparklehorse as a project more generally. I mean, they achieved something. I mean, they got me sort of interested enough to pursue it, but they were also slightly lucky in the songs that I got hold of first, that the likes of Saturday were in those, because frankly, I think if there were some of the other songs had been ones I'd downloaded first, it wouldn't have clicked at that time, and I don't know if I would have gone on to pursue the band. Maybe it would have been better to actually put on one of his strongest but more representative tunes, because the college rock thing is really quite a small part, and as I say, that was actually technically written by one of his previous bands. Another one actually that has that alt country thing that I thought you would like as well is track 15, Sad and Beautiful World.
get so sad. Sometimes you
which is bizarrely the most streamed track on that particular album on Spotify. That surprised me, but it's a good example of the Sparklehorse project more broadly. It's unfussy and delicate. It's a nice song without reaching the sort of emotional nadir of later works. Yeah, that's one that's grown on me over the years. So, I mean, with regards to Viva Dixie in general, I can see why so many people pull for this record. It's auteured, so it feels maybe a little bit more intimate and direct. There's more of an immediate connection with the songwriter. It has some really great moments, but it also has a lot of dabbling in different ideas that I think breaks the flow and kind of prevents me getting into it overall. As I say, I'm just not entirely convinced by Sparklehorse rocking out, and generally that mentally drags me out of things, and so I find the runtime of this album just a little bit fatiguing as well. It sounds like a first album, albeit a very good one.
Yeah, I was going to say, it definitely comes from the era where you could take chances on your first record. We don't have that anymore. I think Capil put it well last week. Is like sometimes there can be great albums which are not flawless. Most records are not flawless, right? And I think it's a decent album. I did find it fatiguing. The runtime for pretty much all the albums, to be fair, was a bit much for me.
Yeah. I think, as you say, it's also of an era when albums were generally just a little bit longer. Like more is more was the thinking. So Good Morning Spider came out in 1998. When I was going through the polls online, I usually do that with ranker sites and stuff like that. I think, from what I recall, this was the one that topped the most lists. It is sort of in a bit of a Goldilocks zone. It's darker than Viva Dixie, but it's not as dark as It's a Wonderful Life, albeit it came after a pretty traumatic period of his life, as we said, when he was on tour with Radiohead, and the subsequent damage to his legs, the wheelchair, the treatment, being in hospital. Certain parts of the album convey a lot of what he went through at this time, although he does say that a lot of it was actually written prior to that, so it wasn't that the songs were written to reflect a difficult time, but I think a lot of the lyrics and the titles and stuff do. Also recorded and played by himself, 17 tracks, which is quite a lot, 54 minutes. The title apparently reflects an old folktale to do with seeing a spider in the morning predicts a sad day. Wow. Good Morning Spider. The first track in that, unlike the previous album, it's Pig, and it's a bold, rocky beginner. Supposedly this song is about his own disdain for his own damaged body post-overdose and treatment. I think it's a fun little garagey song, but it feels a bit throwaway to me. Just, again, as I said, they're not a rock band to me.
This album is a bit more rocky all over, do you not think?
Yeah, it has a fair few bits, yeah. St. Mary is a significant one thematically. It's another one it's about his time in hospital and recovery.
To the woods, dear girls, I must get back to the woods.
It plumbs some really deep depths, maybe as much as almost any song by them, I think. The only thing is it lacks the redeeming sweetness of some of the other songs, which makes it, I think, quite a painful listen. As I said, Mark Linkous tends, when he gets too dark, he seems to be quite aware of it and adds something to the song, a little bit of levity, a kind of a cracked smile. I don't know how to explain it. It's very subtle, but this one doesn't have that. It doesn't even give you that little moment of relief. So it is painful, and I mean that in an emotional sense, of course. Sick of Goodbyes, 5th track in it. Actually a pretty jubilant tune, really quite different, really well realised. I'm not mad on the first part of the song, but it goes into these great refrains, these two great extended chorus refrains. I think it's kind of similar to something that the Flaming Lips would do if they weren't, to me, so annoying.
I think that song sounds a bit British, Beatlesy almost. But I think it was also coming around about the time of Britpop, so I wonder if there was any of that floating around in his head. I mean, he was definitely having some success in that market, so it could be. And he was surrounded by a lot of musicians from that scene. Also, he works with a girl from the Cardigans a lot, and he's clearly keen on that. Yeah, definitely.
The 7th track, Sunshine.
I opened my eyes and watched
Another powerfully fragile little bit of music with it's got a lot of really delicious subtle little swells, bits of keyboardy orchestration that are understated but incredibly effective. Vic Chestnut, the Canadian artist, was meant to be on this record but couldn't make it, so the song contains a phone message apology faintly in the background from Vic Chestnut.
Is that what that was?
Yeah, that's what that voice is. Track 8, Chaos of the Galaxy / Happy Man. Interesting one because it's got loads of radio static in it, which was apparently put on there by Mark Linkous to prevent the label using it as a single because it was so catchy.
It is pretty catchy, and it kind of fades into being a real song towards the end.
Exactly, it does that, yeah, but that was to prevent that recording. Yeah. But then he was ultimately talked into remixing it, or redoing a version without the static to enable it to be radio played. I think the simple guitar riff on that is just such great writing. It's got a Dinosaur Jr. feel to it,
totally,
except good. It's actually a surprisingly good song once you get past the madness at the start of it. Track 9 on that, Hey Joe, is a Daniel Johnston cover.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Hey George, do your chores, don't feel sore.
I think that song's fine.
It's just Daniel Johnston's fine, he's revered. It makes sense in the context of Sparklehorse. That's kind of his crowd. Daniel Johnston fans are definitely in there. The 10th track in this was one of my earliest downloads by them, Come On In, and overwhelming in its understatedness. The central vocal in it almost sounds like it's gained, but it almost sounds bit crushed. Like it feels like it's really disintegrating and maybe somewhat submerged in the song as well. I really like that one. I think it's weathered really well.
I agree. The last thing I listened to before we recorded this was Junebug, which is again not typical for Sparklehorse.
Yeah, not one of my favourites.
And I was a bit surprised that it makes sense to end the rockier album with a song which is a bit rockier, right? But it's just not what you come to expect.
No, there's a couple other references in here. Ghost of His Smile, the 14th track, is a strong Grandaddy tune to me, but with somebody out of Mercury Rev on vocals or something. And track 15, Hundreds of Sparrows, is a personal favourite of mine.
It's a good song.
Yeah, I've added that to a lot of playlists over the years.
Every hair on your head is counted. You are worth hundreds of sparrows.
And for some reason, I really love that line, the tree I planted has become fecund. It's just such an odd line in a song, but it's become a hook in its weirdness. I think overall I find that record actually a wee bit too long. I find it a little bit fatiguing. That won't bother fans, but with my cynical hat on, there are a few tracks that I would quite readily have dropped and, in my humble opinion, would have created a really great standalone piece of work with a much higher level of consistency. So we'll skip by It's a Wonderful Life for the moment. Dreamt for light years in the belly of a mountain.
Yeah.
So this album took almost 5 years to make, I believe, after It's a Wonderful Life, and he said a lot of that was down to his problems with depression. The album's okay. I have to be honest, I'm not as familiar with it as the others, but I think that is partly because whenever I listen to it, it doesn't reel me in the same way. I'm not compelled to go back and repeatedly listen to it. In 2006, he told Pitchfork that many of the songs on it were actually cut from It's a Wonderful Life because they were a bit too poppy, and I think it sounds a little bit like an outtakes record. Supposedly after he'd been listening to, you know, the Grey album, which was like the mashup of the Jay-Z's Black album and the Beatles White album.
Few divas, what more can I tell you? Let me spell it for you. W-I-L-L-I-E. Nobody truer than H-O-V. And I'm back for more. New York's ambassador. Prime Minister, back to finish my business up.
He loved that, so he'd arranged for Danger Mouse to come into the studio and help him finish this. Morning Hollow on it.
She done well. All the murders of crows.
Which it was actually Tom Waits on piano. Morning Hollow appears in some editions of It's a Wonderful Life.
So the Spotify one?
Yeah, not all of them though. The 7th track in this, Ghost in the Sky, I think is one of Sparklehorse's strongest rock songs, albeit it's not something that I think the project is great at, but that one works. So
Dance for death, you lay in the morning fires. The ghost in the sky. The ghost in the sky.
crisp guitar fuzziness that sounds a wee bit de-eyed but manages to retain a good balance of like energy, and the song's got bags of melody in it. The 12th track in that, the title track, Dreamt for Light Years in the Belly of a Mountain, I mean, to call it epic seems wrong since it's so slow and understated, but it's definitely epic in the emotional content as well as the runtime, just under 11 minutes. To me, it's like a song suspended in amniotic fluid. It's really dreamy. There's a very ethereal, otherworldly vibe to that. Lushly arranged, the warm pads, little bits of woodwind, flute especially, and it's got that little asynchronous bloop sound that runs through it. That sound sort of brings to mind like a beacon or a heart machine, you know, a hospital sounds, and I think given the context that sort of adds to the gravitas of it. It's a deep bit of music. I really like it.
Is that not the one that's on some of the versions of It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah, under a different name.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. The only other full record in existence is Dark Night of the Soul from 2010, released posthumously, but largely recorded and produced while Mark Linkous was alive. This time, rather than bringing in Danger Mouse, he started with Danger Mouse, and they wrote this record with a view to bringing in all these guest performers, mainly to do vocals, but a number of other things besides. So on here you've got James Mercer of the Shins, you've got Wayne Coyne of the Flaming Lips, Julian Casablancas of the Strokes, Jason Little of Grandaddy, Black Francis or Frank Black of the Pixies, Iggy Pop, that guy, Nina Persson of the Cardigans that we spoke about, she's on a lot of his stuff, Suzanne Vega, Vic Chestnut, who we already spoke about, David Lynch, Scott Spillane of Neutral Milk Hotel. And these are actually, I mean, in terms of branding, a lot of these bands are stick-ons for what Sparklehorse fans listen to. You know, Flaming Lips, Neutral Milk Hotel, The Shins, Grandaddy in particular. Those are right down the line.
A massive headache in my aging skull means I do not feel well. Pain.
The The album was delayed for a while due to a legal dispute with EMI and I think a company called Lex Records, that was Danger Mouse's label.
Yeah, they were an offshoot of Warp Records.
Oh, right, really?
Yeah, so the guy started off like renting an office in the Warp Records building in London, or the offices they own. He like basically had a desk in there, and he started. They only do like 3 or 4 albums a year. They don't do a lot of records, but they've released MF Doom stuff and all that as well.
Right,
and
well, that makes sense because they went on to collaborate.
Yeah, so so it's quite a cool, like quote unquote cool record label.
So, well, that dispute actually led to quite a strange situation. David Lynch was involved in this record as well, and the theme was that he was going to do a book of photography that accompanied the album, which he did, but then that book was released with a blank CDR. And then a sort of notice that said, this CDR's blank, do with it what you will, and the music of the album is available here. I don't quite know how that got round the restrictions or the dispute, but it did. It was also interesting, like, as I mentioned, Vic Chestnut was on this.
Grand chandelier, where we all together have shared holiday dinner.
Vic Chestnut's another musician from this scene that took his own life. This came out 8 months after his suicide, and I think that suicide also purportedly affected Mark quite substantially. The album's nice, it's fine, it's a variety of different voices, so I think it's harder to get immersed in it, really, you know, because you're always hearing a new take on something. It feels sort of like a bit of a compilation. It's a bit more of a passive experience. You're not getting drawn into this one man's world in the same way as you do in some of these other records, and as a result as well, the lyrics feel a little bit less not relatable, but you know, you're getting less insight into the person because the person's always changing. I do think though that the first track in it, Revenge, fucking hell, it's such a good song.
In my mind, I have shot you and stabbed you through your heart.
I have to say, I never thought I'd enjoy anything that featured a member of the Flaming Lips as much. Wayne Coyne does the vocals in this. I think it's actually credited to Flaming Lips, a co-writing thing. It's really moving. It's got a grandiosity to it that I don't know. I can imagine it accompanying like a funeral scene in a film of Mark Linkous's life. Yeah, I mean, it's got that kind of level of grandiosity to it.
Once you start the path of revenge, there's no way to stop, and the more I try.
Yeah. Really, really cinematic piece of music. I love it. It's borne repeated listens ever since I first heard it on this. Yeah, and then the only other, I mean, there's other bits and bobs out there by Sparklehorse. The only other really interesting thing, I think, and especially given you're here, Mark, is that Ninjarous came out in 2019. Danger Mouse released it, and that was a collaboration between Sparklehorse and MF Doom.
Oh, wow.
Rocks, pissed on them, switch the box, tickets, keep them socks, where's the kiss on them? Silver green, argyle, yank, fitted, headed. Anything he spitted at, tilted it, dead it. Storm gators, a little more complicated. A competition slayer, no pay for no.
Yeah,
I had no idea about that.
That was one of the rarities that they said sort of crept out, even though his estate had been quite resistant to putting out that sort of stuff.
That's interesting. That was before that. Was that before MF Doom died? Was it 2020 he died? I think it was last year, wasn't it? Yeah. 2021, I think it was the start of 2021 he died. Yeah. Interesting.
So it brings us to It's a Wonderful Life.
It is a Wonderful Life.
Allegedly. From 2001. Now this, unlike the two albums that came prior, was played with a full band, and it does change the aesthetic of the album quite a bit. He's commented on it saying, I didn't want to play every instrument on every song. I didn't want to be behind the control console the whole time. I wanted to have other people's brains and input involved. And the results, I mean, you know, spoiler alert, the results are so good that this is what makes me think, you know, this guy, he cut himself down in his prime. He'd only just really started working with other musicians. The first 2 albums and the majority of that part of his career was auteured. It was a lonely experience to some extent, even though he had a live band. This is different and more expansive as a result. Now, it's their most successful album. I think it sold 63,000 copies, but 63,000 copies, whilst it's a lot these days, definitely wasn't then. So it's 2001, and to put it in perspective, 2 years later, Linkin Park sold just short of 1 million copies in the first week of Meteora coming out. So 63,000 is not a lot, especially for a band that the name, even if you aren't familiar with them, the name is pretty ubiquitous.
It'd probably explain why their next record didn't come out in Capitol. It came out a different record label. You know?
Yeah. So there's only so many people going to mono. We discovered
literally only so many.
Monorail. Yeah. The listens on Spotify, I've noticed, far outstrip other records, and I wasn't really sure why that was the case. I thought at first it might be due to the fact that there were other personnel involved, which we'll go on to discuss, or is it just a more enduring work? Maybe a bit of both. Linkous got Tom Waits involved in this, which was a big moment for him personally and professionally. He talked about being really nervous before calling him. He said he had 5 shots of whiskey before he phoned him. Eventually they apparently met in an SUV in California and ended up driving about in this SUV discussing the project, and then also I believe it was a hatred of turkey vultures and their favourite animals, which is actually quite Tom Waits, I suppose, if you think about it.
Aye.
All of the album's songs were accompanied by videos by specific directors. I think there's like the Key Brothers, Gareen Tarosian, Grant G was on it, Guy Madden. Was Jem Cohen one of them as well, maybe? So these actually became the subject of a 2001 episode of the Sundance Channel's series Sonic Cinema. For people who are curious, you can go out and maybe try and find it. The tracks themselves, it starts with the title track, It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a wonderful life. It's a wonderful life.
Which is a trembling, fuzzy little whisper of a song with playful lyrics about being the only one who can ride that horse. It also has a nice use of little sound effects textures, sort of like swinging about in the background. If you listen to this in headphones, there's some really cool little artifacts going on in there.
I'm a bog of poison frogs.
Yeah, I've written that I very much enjoy the hi-fi, lo-fi vibe, because it's kind of what it is. It's lo-fi with a full band and a big studio.
And experience, you know.
And I picked out like lots of tiny sounds. It's really restrained, but the fact they keep dropping it, they keep dropping in little weird artifacts of sound, shows an odd desire to kind of be a bit more maximalist, but not really quite taking it, because that's not what you do with this kind of stuff, you know. The bubbling synths, the string section, how low key his voice is, it's just a really gentle song, you know.
Agreed. The second track, Gold Day, this features Nina Persson from Cardigans. It also features Adrian Utley from Portishead.
Yep, it does.
As we said earlier on, the suggestion is that this is Sparklehorse's darkest record. It's definitely their most measured, the most patient, but you know, a bit like the opening track, whilst this is sort of sad, it manages to be quietly positive and uplifting at the same time, you know.
It really follows on from that track as well. It almost bleeds into it. A couple of the songs do that in this. It's like it takes the vibe in a new direction, which is really, really interesting. From a sequence, the sequence in this record is fucking great as a result of that.
Yeah. it has that Mercury Rev Grandaddy thing going on, which means it never gets, too dark to be nice. It's got that uplifting quality to it.
The melody reminds me of the Beach Boys, the vocal melody.
All right, okay.
Just a little bit. And the way that Nina's like slight harmony in the chorus is great. It's really pared back and restrained. And the guitar solo in particular has got a really big George Harrison vibe for me. It feels really Beatlesy. One of the things that I wasn't sure about, and I don't know if I like or dislike this about the song, but when the chorus kicks in, his voice goes lower down in the mix and the strings come up higher.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I like that or not. I couldn't decide if I liked that
It's
or not.
a strange production decision, eh? The third track, Piano Fire, is again one of the first tracks I got by this band, and I mean I think I must have been lucky, because I don't think it's just nostalgia. I do think this is one of their best tunes.
Oh, it's a banger.
It's an absolutely brilliant song, featuring PJ Harvey and John Parrish.
I got sunburned, waiting for the jets to land. Circus people with hairy plans.
The rockier songs, as I've mentioned a few times now, sometimes struggle to convince me. This one could have fallen into that trap, but it does something a bit different. It doesn't try and sound like a kind of typical real band. I mean, it does have drums, it does have amplification, but it embraces a sort of slightly surreal production. It's not attempting to sort of trick the listener. PG Harvey's vocal involvement, and it's identifiable, but it's actually quite minimal. It's the song and the writing of the song that does the bulk of the heavy lifting in this, and it's a really catchy, really memorable tune.
I can't seem to breathe with rusty metal heart.
Yeah, when you were talking about the production, it is a bit anachronistic in some ways, because you've got that really scuzzy guitar sound, and then there's a clean guitar right over the top of it, and it's really not what you would expect. And in between the verses, there's loads of really cool sounds going on. You've got that piano, kind of weird synthy bit. It's a small drum machine as well.
Yeah, there's things that pop in and out in your headphones as well.
Yeah,
the panning
clever,
is weird.
Clever.
Yep. Sea of Teeth, fourth track.
Venus on your skin. Can you taste the crush?
Harkens back to some of the extremely understated little whisper songs in the previous two albums. I think this is probably one of the tracks that helps define this album in people's heads as being particularly somber. Applebed, the fifth track in this, another one of those early downloads for me. Nina Persson on it, a guy called Bob Roop on bass, Jane Scarpantoni on cello, and Joan Wasser on violin. I'm not familiar with those names. If you're an indie scenester or a Nick Hornby fan, then maybe you are.
Doctor, please.
Another favourite for me, just a gorgeous central theme. The intimacy of the vocal delivery in places, including Nina Persson's harmonies in this, pulls you in really close, like it's a warm hug of a song. He also uses some really playful chord descents at the end of each chorus to ease the tension that the air of melancholy is created. Because it is quite a melancholy song, but then there's these little descents that sort of take that edge off each time.
Yeah, I really like the way the drum machine bounces about, like and sort of the way it pans left to right, and then the bass is panned hard right and the guitar's hard left, or as vice versa. Basically, they're in different spaces. It's all in different spaces in the mix.
Friend, you could be my dog. You could be my light. You could be my fog.
It's really easy to make that sound like shit if you're producing something, but like in the end, again, cool outro, lots of layers of cello underneath looping samples. It's just really well considered.
The sixth one, King of Nails.
Toothless kiss of skeletons and summer hail. I'm the king of nails. I drink my liquor from the palm of a child.
It's a rockier one again, but I think unlike the previous records, he has really pushed the envelope with the artificial band thing. It arrives at a place, it's almost like an industrial take on indie rock. It's really clanking snare and a lot of saturation on the instruments. It's also got a really nice contrast between a very mellow vocal and that really maximalised indie instrumentation. So whilst it's not my favourite song in terms of the actual writing, I do think it's a really interesting production job on it.
It gives me Alex Smith vibes with the vocal.
Yeah.
And the backing vocals, a lot of the female backing vocals, but they're not done by PJ Harvey and Nina Persson, is by Sol Seppi, who's worked with him quite a lot in the last couple of albums as well. But she's all over a lot of these tracks, and she's really good. Her voice is really good in this as well, the harmonies that she does. The guitar solo feels a bit British to me. I can almost imagine this being like a latter day Blur song in another life.
Aye, that's a good point. I never considered that. iPenny's 7th track. Fucking love this song. PG Harvey, John Parrish again, this time teaming up with Adrian Utley. I think it's Utley, by the way. It could be Utley, I guess, but from Portishead. Hell of a fucking combination.
Oh yeah, PG Harvey on guitar as well, which is great.
Yeah. One of the saddest and most touching tracks Sparklehorse ever did for me. PG Harvey plays a much more critical role in this, both in the guitar but also in the vocal trade-offs. Mark's line in it about "I will return here one day and dig up my bones from the clay," I think that's really iconic. Without ever getting particularly animated, the song manages the most subtle crescendos in each chorus as well. It doesn't seem like it gets louder, but there's a sort of emotional crescendo that goes on in there. It's a beautiful piece of work.
It's very much like the Magnolia Electric Company. That's what it reminded me of.
That's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the way that, again, the vocal panning is just really great in it.
Isn't it interesting how these tragic figures are so synonymous with each other and they keep bringing to mind each other's music?
It is. There must be an essay on that.
Melina, Elliott Smith, Mark Linkous, and Vic Chestnut. Yeah.
This song for me has got a real transatlantic vibe as well. It feels British and English at the same time, which is pretty cool. British and American at the same time.
I was going to say, well,
British.
Yeah.
They are one and the same thing.
The 8th track on it, Dog Door. Now, this is a big song for this album, but straight at the gate here, I don't particularly like this song.
Really? I fucking love this song.
Right. It features Tom Waits. It also features Adrian Utley on what they call kitty cat guitar, whatever
and
that
fuzzy, is it fuzz ending bass as well? The bass at the end.
It was obviously a huge moment for him. It sounds so much like Tom Waits, especially around the era of Filipino box spring hog.
Cooking up a Filipino box spring hog. Spider rolled in from a Hollister suburb on a one-eyed stolen mare. Donned himself with
That sort of Tom Waits, that I find the inclusion of it on here a little jarring.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the kind of later album with the compilation Dark Night of the Soul, where I'm like, alright, this is like a guest song. It disrupts the flow a little bit for me. That said, I was mindful that in the same way as, a quiet song can be almost a little sorbet in a loud album, maybe this is playing that role in reverse.
Yeah, that's a good point. It sounds maybe it's because I just listened to Mule Variations before I put this on. It sounds like it could have been on that record.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. I'm surprised though, and this maybe answers a kind of question we posed just a short time ago. The relatively low listen count for this on Spotify. I think it's about 850,000. That maybe throws into question that idea that the higher listen count for this album overall is due to the guest performers, because you would think that Tom Waits, I mean obviously PJ Harvey, but Tom Waits would be one of the main draws there, and especially this song also features a member of Portishead, so yeah, it's not got to 1 million listens, so that can't then necessarily explain the much higher listen count that this album gets over the previous two.
And it is quite quintessentially Tom Waits sound, and it feels as though Mark Linkous is writing a Tom Waits. He probably was.
Exactly.
It's probably exactly what he was doing, you know.
More Yellow Birds, the 9th track.
In the poison ranks of strangers, please send me more yellow birds for the dim.
Miguel Rodriguez is on it. Alan Weatherhead, I think, was the engineer in this one. Somebody called Margaret White.
He plays lap steel as well, Alan Weatherhead.
Right, okay. Nice tune. Not an outstanding tune in context. A bit more straightforward in production, with a really nice violin and cello throughout.
Will he still be blind, or do they go by smell? Will you promise me not?
This is very my jam, obviously.
Yes, clearly.
Alan Weatherhead, I did a bit of research. He worked with Daniel Johnson and the Magnolia Electric Company.
Wow.
So the lap steel and the mellotron, he does mellotron as well on it.
The loop has closed.
Yeah, so the loop is closed.
Little Fat Baby, the 10th track.
Wisdom teeth, you burn, you crisp.
I'm not sure what to say about this song. I like it, but I don't know why.
It's got some really nice sentiments in it. Bob Roop, Jane Scarpantoni again, Joan Wasser. Another tune that, whilst being understated, manages to sound a bit good-natured and playful, almost affectionate. The lyrics go a long way to achieving that.
It's got really big pop strings.
He got dragged by a donkey through the switches and the myrtle.
Yeah, and it just generally, it's downbeat compared to, you know, any number of other bands like the fucking Hives or something like that, right? But it doesn't lend itself to the idea that this album is overbearingly depressing.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand even more so now, like I've said, you know, given the legacy of him and his unfortunate demise, but I don't think they're that depressing.
No.
Compared to Elliott Smith, it's kind of like, it's not fucking upbeat, it's not, you know, it's not fucking pop punk, but
You can tell why he was so browned off with that trope in the press. Devil's New, the 11th. Things do start to get a little bit more somber here. Less so in that the tracks are incredibly upsetting, but more in that there's a strange decay that overtakes the album here. A lot of like weird, confused and downbeat arrangements. This one has these vocal loops that speed up and slow down, and the piano actually is going forwards and then partially backwards, and in almost, I don't say free form, it's obviously not free form, but it's a very loose refrain that it's playing and the song's been fitted around it. It's nice, it's slightly hypnotic and a bit surreal, less structured than some of the other ones around it.
I've written here that it feels like you're waking up from a bittersweet dream. See, when the big strings come in, that's kind of the thing that I felt when I was, as if you're kind of, or even like you've been lost in a reverie and you're coming back to reality, you know. And the warped vocals give it that kind of dreamy kind of vibe. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. Aye, completely. Comfort Me, the 12th track.
With rocks in my dress, and smoke in my...
Rex L. White doing some pedal steel guitar in this one. It's pretty crucial to it. More Grandaddy vibes in this one. Again, sort of sad but simultaneously softly jubilant, I guess.
Won't you come to comfort me? Won't you come to comfort me?
the song itself slowly accrues all these parts as it goes along and builds towards this genuinely uplifting closing refrain. And in some versions, this is the final track, and I think it's a perfect final track.
I would agree with that.
I love the ending.
I would agree with that. I've said the exact same thing. The Optigan, it uses the Optigan in this one, and the keys and the lap steel work really well together, and when it does come to that big crescendo towards the end, it's good, and it does fade off with that whistling wind, so it really, you can totally see why this would be the last song on the record.
Other versions have Babies on the Sun in track 13, a peculiar little deconstructed mini song which is kind of surplus to requirements.
It's a proper chamber pop song, right? It's a very 30s feeling.
And then there's more deviation here. So track 14 takes the form of Maxine on some versions. Which has some of those original players like Scott Minor and Rex White. Now this is kind of complicated because this is the track that was aka Dreamt for Light Years in the Belly of a Mountain, the title track of the album that follows it, because this only featured in a small number of versions. I think it was the Devil in the Woods edition of the double album of this album. It also featured in the Gold Day single/EP, but I guess people were like, this is such a good bit of music, it needs to be properly featured on a record, and lo and behold, it crops up in the next one. There are other versions which feature Morning Hollow with Tom Waits on piano.
She don't get up when I go into the room.
I think that could be the nicer track, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, it's a more low key song, and it's really laid back, and it's got nice ebo guitars in it and stuff. And if this is like the denouement, I guess, then this would be the dreamy epilogue. We're back to normality here. We're back to reality.
Yeah. So I mean, Sparklehorse was a flawed band fronted by a guy with immense talent and 1 million ideas plus. There's a lot going on here, and given all that is going on here, you can only imagine the sort of music he might have gone on to write. You alluded to that earlier on. I mean, especially if if Wayne Coyne's career trajectory is anything to go by, like Mark Linkous had a production future ahead of him. I think he had a collaboration future. I'm sure he had a solo career. I'm sure he had another band. It underlines the tragedy, I think. He did leave a remarkably consistent legacy, especially across those first 3 albums, as we've said. I think the last 2 albums are fine. I'm sure if you're a completist, you're very into them. Whilst he's celebrated in musician and muso circles, he was maybe a bit too dark, a bit too obscure, and perhaps a bit too inconsistent stylistically, even just in the course of any given album, to attain the breakthrough success that the likes of Mercury Rev, Flaming Lips, and even Grandaddy enjoyed. I mean, the Software Slump by Grandaddy is a perfect example of a very consistent, focused album that just got a lot of support behind it. And Mercury Rev and the Flaming Lips both had their big breakthrough things, and Sparklehorse, I feel, probably had one of them in them, or in him. It just never got to that point.
I think if the next album would have been a Sparklehorse album produced or written with Danger Mouse, that was Mark Linkous doing it all, I think that would have been the crossover success that he was probably looking for by working with him.
Possibly. I mean, it's easy to categorise them alongside those acts that we've mentioned, but I do think that Linkous' Demons seemed far more in control of his fate than theirs ever seemed. I'm sure various members of those bands have had their issues. Certainly I know they have, in fact, but his definitely overcame him. I don't know, he occupies a kind of tragic extreme of that strange little indie scene of acts that had sprung up. I would suggest that despite the relative high esteem in which he's held and the critical plaudits afforded to all 3 of those early records, this one in particular, in the pantheon of that indie scene that we're talking about, and just the indie scene of the early 90s, mid-90s in general, for obvious reasons, he never really peaked, and has also since somewhat faded, you know, from just communal playlists and stuff. And I think he really qualifies on that basis in this record, especially because this record, whilst it may be very well known for fans of Sparklehorse, is not nearly as well known as it should be more generally. And I just want to preserve him in discussions of that kind of music. I think he should be in all those discussions as being just as good as any of those bands and artists that we've named throughout this.
I think you're right. There is a danger of him being not fully forgotten, but forgotten in a way which Elliott Smith wasn't big when he passed away. He was starting to gain some traction, but then he passed away and then he got huge after his death. And I think that it's a shame that didn't happen to this band as well, because equally as good, in my opinion, this album is equally as good as anything Elliott Smith certainly ever did, you know.
Well, Elliott Smith also struggled for a consistent album that summed him up. Yeah,
he had a lot of great songs peppered across a large amount of records, you know, 5 records, and some posthumous stuff, which was also really good, which probably shouldn't have been released, but that's a conversation that we've had a few times, and I'm not a fan of the posthumous album. But
maybe that was in the thinking of Mark Linkous' estate as well, when they sort of declined a lot of the different offers.
We've come across that so many times with Jay Dilla, MF Doom. It's happening to MF Doom right now. I suppose Magnolia Electric Company is a good example of the legacy gets withered the more that you put out there, because you get further away from the great thing, you know.
Yeah, it's very, very rare that it reaches the same heights, you know. But then again, you're doing it for the diehards, you know.
Yeah, I think it's totally qualifies. He's popular enough for people to go, oh yeah, but not popular enough to be like, oh fuck, like that's huge. Why are you doing that? You know, and I think it meets the criteria. For sure.
Good. I'm glad you got a chance to familiarise yourself with it as well, because it is something that I think you'll get a bit of nourishment out of.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed listening. It actually made me want to listen to Tom Waits again because of the Tom Waits song. But yeah, I'm going to go back to this guy for sure.
So I'll put together a little playlist of some of the kind of highlights, my own personal ones. I'm sure you'll disagree with a lot of them, or have many more that you'd like to be on there, but it'll serve as a little bit of an introduction for people that are not totally familiar. Mark.
Yes, Chris.
We're going to do a Nexus.
We're going to do a Nexus. It's back again, 2 weeks in a row. What's happening?
A complicated series of connections between different things.
So the Nexus this week is courtesy of Catalyze, legendary long-term listener.
And Nexuser, I love it.
Catalyze chose John Valanthan. I had to look it up. He's one of those ones.
Yeah, he's not. Is he Mark Linkous famous?
He's still alive famous. So John Valanthan is clearly famous for his work with the Scouts, and also for being that guy that went into a cave in Thailand and saved that young football team. Was it a football team? It was.
Yeah, it was.
What the fuck was a football team doing in a cave?
It was him and a few of his cave diving friends.
Is that where they keep them, or there?
Musk will be on the phone soon.
Give them let's club together and buy them a fucking dressing room like every other team. Alright? Yeah, I read a part of his story that was like, to find them he couldn't see very much, so he'd stick his head out the water to smell for human shite, and that was how he knew he was getting close to them.
Pretty clever, to be fair.
Yeah. Anyway, John Valanthan. By the way, John Valanthan wasn't the only one that saved those kids. There's also a guy called Richard Stanton, who was his kind of dive partner, and he should be mentioned.
And also, very famously, Vernon Unsworth, who was a caver that had explored the cave 6 years before, he played an advisory role in the operation, and it was the person that was called Pedo Guy by Elon Musk. I mean, it seems like the kind of thing that Gaza would have got involved in as well. Yeah. You know, remember the Raoul Moat thing where he came striding down with a fishing rod and a bottle of Buckfast or whatever the fuck it was. It was a bucket of KFC.
Right, anyway, so Sparklehorse. This Sparklehorse is a bar in Partick. Mark's mentioned it already. That bar is part owned by Sci-Fi Steve of Biss.
Oh, okay.
The band Biss, yeah. Biss had a track called Icky Poo Air Raid on Rough Trade Indie Pop #1 compilation. The lyrics in that go at one point. They slag her off constantly, totally rate this Boyzone LP. She's sitting in a corner there listening to Huggy Bear. That's very Biss. I'm not a huge Biss fan, but you know, they've got their place. Anyway, the band mentioned in those lyrics, Boyzone. Can you believe it? Colin Farrell was once scouted in a club in Ireland whilst wearing, I might add, leather trousers and a rubber t-shirt. And invited to audition for Boyzone, but apparently his rendition of Careless Whisper was so fucking bad that they never heard back from them. And as it turns out, Colin Farrell has been cast to play heroic cave diver John Volanthen.
Wow.
In a Ron Howard adaptation alongside Viggo Mortensen as his partner Richard Stanton and some, I assume, pedo looking guy for the other boy. John Volanthen, to be fair to him, did point out that Rowan Atkinson might have been a more accurate cast. But yeah, Colin Farrell apparently went into like some serious training, did the whole kind of method Tom Cruise thing, you know, learning how to hold his breath for long periods of time. He ran a marathon when they wrapped some aspect of the shooting as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. There you go. Nexus.
Good for John. So, as we discussed, the posthumous album Dark Night of the Soul by Sparklehorse was a collaboration with Danger Mouse. In 2005, Danger Mouse worked with MF Doom on The Mouse and the Mask, which we've talked about on this podcast before.
Yep.
And that features a lot of samples from Adult Swim TV shows, and some characters pop up as well on the record, and it's quite fun. Over the years, like Adult Swim, as we discussed in that episode, but if you haven't listened to it, they've always had a really close kind of affiliation with lots of different musical artists because it's part of their edgy sort of
Their
vibe.
shtick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the people that has worked with them is an LA-based artist called Young Jake. In 2016, he apparently was set to start writing a TV series for them, but nothing's been heard of it since. But he is like he's directed a bunch of music videos and stuff like that. He did one for Pusha T, and so he is like reasonably well known. I say reasonably well known because in 2019 he released a track with Elon Musk called R.I.P. Harambe.
Harambe.
On the way to heaven, amen, amen. R.I.P. Harambe, smoking on so strong, and gorillas too, and we thinking about you. All we ever do.
Which apparently mocks the internet sensationalism, quote unquote internet sensationalism, around the animal's demise. Elon Musk is our very own Iron Man wannabe, but who's actually just a James Bond villain. He has some choice words for the Thai cave divers, calling Vernon Unsworth a pedo guy. He was just raging because he came up with this idea of putting a submarine down there, but the guys had already figured out how to do it.
That's right, yeah.
And basically Vernon Unsworth said he had no conception of what a cave passage was like, and he can stick his submarine up where it hurts. And that's when Musk called him a pedo guy.
That's right, because apparently when they were getting the wee boys out, they had them like swaddled effectively, and they could only just fit them through the gaps in it. So big fucking Elon with his big fucking ego, how's he going to get his fucking submarine in there?
Exactly.
Excuse the pun, but what a fucking rocket.
Yeah, what a rocket indeed. He later deleted the tweets and apologised. And Elon Musk, bizarrely, he was one of the 187 people who received honours from the King of Thailand for helping out as part of the mission, which is utterly bizarre.
Maybe because he was slagging them, it made them be like, right, we're fucking definitely going to save these kids just to get it right of that Elon Musk. And they were thinking about going at it a bit half-heartedly, like, yeah, we get half of them, that's fine. But as soon as Elon was on their case and the King of Thailand saw that, he was like, that's clever, that's reverse psychology, that's Elon trying to bam them up and get a better performance out of them. That's good management. Maybe that's how he got to the top.
Maybe it is.
Maybe he is as rich as he deserves to be.
Maybe he is. Wow. But yeah, Vernon Unsworth, as I said, he was a recreational caver who had been in that cave 6 years earlier and advised John Valanson and Richard Stanton on, how to go in and conduct that mission. So
Brilliant. And we don't mean to spoil the film when it inevitably comes out, but the Waynes all survived. Boo.
I've just read here. He sent an email to BuzzFeed News, Elon Musk, saying that Unsworth was a child rapist and they had married a child. And then he just, in his defence, said that pedo guy is a common insult in South Africa. It's anonymous with a creepy old man. Jesus.
Wow, it doesn't get any better, does it? I was waiting for the redemption factor to kick in there, but no, it didn't happen.
Yeah, well, the court basically threw out Unsworth's defamation case, and basically he sought $180 million in damages, and all they got was an apology for Elon Musk.
Fuck.
Which is fucking brutal.
That is brutal.
Anyway, thanks for putting up with us this week, folks. Next week is another mystery.
Yeah, we're keeping it close to our chest.
We are.
Not because we don't know what's happening. That's not it at all.
We've got many different things that are potentially happening. We just need to figure out which one is going to be.
Yeah, it's what one can we get finished in time.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
But they're all good. Every
all
one of
good.
them. Well, apart from one of them.
Well, what one's that?
Nah, just
Is it the rest of
don't
them?
tell them in case it's the one we put out next week. Anyway, catch you later. Bye.